it's been interesting, kind of getting in the headspace to go and talk to people again. Usually I talk to a camera in the basement, and actually I'm looking at my dryer most of the time because it's pointed at me, and the desk is behind me, and my dryer is right there.
You turned up. You were tired of looking at the dryer.
Oh yeah, I got that. I knew you needed a change of scenery, so I put up some decorations for you.
Where are your distance signs pointing to?
I don't know.
In the background there, you have, so far.
Oh, national parks, yeah, and they're not. It was a sign that was made for us by someone that is a friend of Carrie Ann's, and I think it was before Jack was born, wasn't it? It was the baby shower. Yeah, but they're not exactly pointing in the correct way. They're just the exact distances to the different things from Canby. So the distances are correct. But yeah, and then I had a whole box of race medals that have just been collecting dust, and I went, I should hang those up or something, because they give you a medal for finishing things, and Carrie Ann went, that's a great idea. And I went, I don't know. And finally I put it up. So anyway, here we are, and today, weirdly enough, I was going to talk about peace. We're in a series. If you haven't been following us along on YouTube, I started a series last week called The Character of God, or Who Was Jesus? And the interesting thing about Jesus is that he actually not only gives parables, which usually in a parable, something means us, or something stands for us, and something stands for God. So he not only does that, but he himself is a parable on how to live. So it's kind of this box in a box situation. And I noticed about myself when this whole thing started, being a teacher, there were things coming at me every single week, it seemed like. We'd get a new set of guidelines one week, we'd sit down, we'd go, okay, and finally we'd have these details hammered out about how to teach in this new time, how to present ourselves to kids, how to have conversations with people, and all of a sudden it was like, we're not reaching these people, let's go reach these people, well, how are we going to do that? And then the next week it was kind of like we started the cycle all over again. And the reason we did is because we'd have new guidelines coming from Oregon Department of Education every single week. And if you were following along in the videos, I began to get a little bit bitter. And hopefully that didn't come out in the messages, but I began telling you about the things that I was going through week by week, and kind of related those to the messages. But I began to get a little bit on the bitter side. And in talking to a pastor friend of mine, I was reminded, not by what we were talking about, but from his sermon series, I was reminded all of a sudden one week out of the blue that I needed to be more like Jesus. Because in the midst of everything that Jesus had going on in his life, the man had something about him that you just can't put your finger on. And of course you want to say, oh, well, he was God. He was God in the flesh. And of course he was able to keep a monumental amount of poise and peace and patience with those around him, and he only really gets riled up once in the Bible, if you're aware. And it was kind of an eye-opener to me to think, wait a second, yes, he is God. He is literally God in the flesh, but what if his character is actually supposed to be our character? And it's supposed to be something that we're striving towards. And so I started dissecting it. I read through the entire story of Jesus in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and kind of came up with a few things that I think were the character of the man who is Jesus. And this week, I want to talk to you about peace. Now, I have created a goal for myself recently, in the last 2 weeks or so. And it kind of has to do with those guidelines I was talking to you about. My goal for myself in the rest of what is 2020 is to get to a peaceful place that reflects who Jesus is. In other words, I want to become as peaceful as Jesus. Now, before I dive into the scripture with you, which is going to be in Luke 14, so if you want to get there while I'm talking through the rest of this, Luke 14, I'm going to start with verse 12. But before I get there, I want to tell you about this word peace. The English language kind of gives us headaches when we talk about what peace is. Normally what comes to your mind if you're thinking peace is the absence of conflict. And that's not our fault. It's because what we know of peace actually comes from a place in Roman history called the Pax Romana. And my sixth graders this year were diving into that and learning a little more about that. But it was kind of funny and ironic. The week before Pax Romana took off, the week before we started learning about Pax Romana, we started focusing on Roman gladiators. The opposite of what you consider peace, right? You show up to a bloody conflict and there's violence and fighting and gore and everything and everybody loves it, and that was kind of what Rome was all about. There was a theory of what's called bread and circuses, and in order to keep your people happy, if you're an emperor in Rome, in the Roman Empire, you make sure they're fed bread, and then you make sure they have circuses, or, violence. And that kind of helps them take the edge off everyday life. We still actually have this theory. If people are well fed, and if people are well entertained, you will most likely not have violent incidences in a population. But if something like what's going on happens, and people are not well fed, and are not well entertained, or at least have something that they're building to in their life, we just saw it recently, violence breaks out. It's the most interesting thing in the human experience, human dynamic, that without those things, and if people are not moving forward and being well entertained and being well fed, violence erupts. So interesting. But I'm not referring to that kind of peace, because the Romans, even though they had this violent culture with their gladiators, sports, and that kind of thing they were doing inside of places like the Colosseum, they referred to a 200-year period as Pax Romana, or peace in Rome. No conflict, right? We're not fighting anymore. But they were. It really didn't actually live up to the view of peace as being without conflict. In fact, different territories that have been occupied by Rome, during the Pax Romana, they would advertise, hey, everybody, we're in this big time of peace and prosperity, everybody party, it's time to have a good time. And so people that were in these territories that Rome had conquered said to themselves, oh, peace. Does that mean do what we want? And Rome kind of came back and said, well, yeah, it means do what you want. Prosperity, right? Peace. We won't bother you. So they said, okay, how about we have our freedom back? No, violently suppressed every single time. So Rome really had a problem with peace. What I want to talk to you about is peace in a storm. Now that, of course, means being at a calm and being of the knowledge that Jesus has control of something, when all around you the evidence might be to the contrary. So we're actually going to look at this story. Jesus puts himself in the midst of people who want to kill him, and he does it on purpose. So we're going to Luke 14. We're going to start with verse 12. Now, Jesus at this time, before I start here, Jesus at this time actually gets invited over to a bunch of Pharisees' houses. We don't talk about this a lot. Jesus actually goes over to the home of guys that want to have him killed and are conspiring to get evidence to have him killed. Jesus, being God, knows about this. He knows that these guys want him dead, and he proceeds, though, to not just simply sit and answer their questions and have dinner with them. He starts to try and teach them something. Jesus has the ultimate peace in the storm here. So verse 12 starts like this. Jesus said to his host, when you give a lunch or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. Notice he's saying this to the host. He's literally going to the host that invited him over, that wants to kill him, and saying, you know how you should really throw a dinner party? So think about that in that lens. It's really hilarious in that way. When you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or even your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Now you're probably asking yourself, what does this have to do with peace? Well, I'm getting to that. The first thing that Jesus demonstrates is that he has ultimate peace. He's telling the host that had him over to this probably rich house we're told that the Pharisees really were, kind of enthralled with their money and not willing to give it away to the poor. And he's telling the host, hey, so next time you have a luncheon, kind of like the one that we're at right now, the one that you've invited me to. I understand I'm eating your food and at your really expensive house, but let me tell you about how to really conduct things. He says, why don't you actually invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind? Isn't that who you're really supposed to be caring about? He's convicting the host that he should be honoring because he invited him over to his house. Jesus demonstrates incredible peace. And he's not lecturing either at this time. Notice he's not angrily saying this in order to provoke something. He's very peaceful in the midst of turmoil. These guys want to see him dead. They're trying to collect evidence on him, obviously, and he is sitting there teaching them. That is true peace. Verse 15. When one of those at the table with him heard this, he said to Jesus, "Blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God." Jesus replied, "A certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests." He's telling a parable. At the time of the banquet, he sent his servant to those who had been invited. He said, "Come, for everything is now ready." But they all began to make excuses. The first said, I've just bought a field and I must go see it. Please excuse me. Another said, "I have just bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me." Still another said, "I just got married, so I can't come." The servant came back and reported this to his master. Then the owner of the house became angry and ordered his servant, "Go out quickly into the streets and alleys of the towns and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame." "Sir," the servant said, "what you ordered has been done, but there is still more room." Then the master told his servant, "Go out to the roads and country lanes then and compel them to come in, so that my house will be full. I tell you, not one of those who were invited will get a taste of my banquet." So what's he telling them? Now you got to understand the audience. First of all, often we as Christians take parables out of context. The context is that Jesus is not necessarily talking to a group of disciples or a group of people off the street, or even, gathering a bunch of people, kind of like the gathering of the 5,000. He's talking specifically to Pharisees. Pharisees are rich people who happen to be, they're supposed to be religious leaders. They're supposed to be people that are actually leading the religion forward, or leading the faith forward. He's talking to me. When I first saw this, I thought to myself, you know what? Listed in context, this parable, someone is always God, someone is always man. I believe that Jesus is actually talking to me, because in the present world, we are of the upper 90% richest in the world, and we are believers. Why wouldn't he be talking to us through that? So what's he trying to say to us? First of all, this could be used 2 ways. The first way that I saw, this is the obvious. The master of the house is God. And if God is asking all of his subjects or people that he is associated with, his friends, that would be us, and he could be asking us, hey, I need you all to do something. I need you all to move on something. Right now would be nice. And we all kind of go, oh, you know what? Yeah, we have that thing. There's a birthday that weekend and I really, really can't. Hey, I've got a dentist appointment. And dentist appointments. I don't know. And lame excuses, right? If you're like me, you've given your share of lame excuses in your life. It's maybe some of them have actually been lame excuses when we really should have been helping God with something. And that's what I believe that was the first meaning of the story. Now, dissecting that a little bit, the reason that I've always, and I've done this, of course, if there's like an event or something like that, I've gone, oh, you know what? That weekend, oh boy, you wouldn't believe. The reason that I actually have that excuse is that I don't quite want to, I know that if it's an event with Christians take up a lot of time. I'm sorry to all of you, but when someone says, hey, we're gonna, there's a work party at the church and we're gonna be here for, I don't know, we'll come in the morning, that really does mean we're gonna be there all day. And I know that. I've been to those work parties, oh my goodness. It's not only paint the church, but then everybody has to talk, and oh my goodness, I carried 6 hours. 6 hours on a Saturday. And then, if it's something like, I know that one year when I was in college or something like that, someone asked me to help out with Canby Christian Church's VBS, and that year I had gotten really, into time and that kind of thing, and time is, time to sleep. And as a kid, you stay up till like 3 in the morning and then you sleep the rest of the day. So in the summer, so I got to do that. And, Jeff, can you help with VBS? Ooh, you know what? Hey, I know that is code for don't just show up at this time to this time. I got to set up, and then you'll want to talk to me afterwards, and then, oh my goodness, then all of a sudden it's like midday. That's when I usually wake up. So, we've all given our lame excuses for that kind of stuff. And what that just means is that I'm not willing to give my time completely to God. That's kind of what that means. And so he's obviously talking about that. You have to have, going back to the peace thing, Jesus has to have a lot of peace to say this, first of all, to these Pharisees, but also you do have to have a lot of peace to truly submit yourself to the work of God, because God does not care that there are 24 hours in a day. And he doesn't care about all the things that you've said, hey God, this has to end by 3, because he doesn't care about that. Because in the grand scheme of things, there are people either going to heaven or hell. That is what God cares about. And we should be caring about people. And that's kind of the mindset he wants to be in. So you have to have an incredible amount of peace to submit to that kind of thing. But as I was reading this, I kind of thought to myself, there is another meaning to this story. What if I'm the master of the house? And then I thought to myself, if I'm the master of the house, how am I inviting people into my presence? As a church, it kind of works like this, right? Church events, Christians love to do another thing. Christians love to fellowship, which is great. We're supposed to do that. That's kind of a hallmark of what it means to be a believer. But in doing so, sometimes we exclude by fellowshipping. And it's not really something that we think about. It's not something that we consciously go, you know what, we're not going to invite those people because they smell bad. But you know what? That's kind of the way that it comes off. We were in Mexico during my second mission trip to Mexico. We're only there for about a week, so we actually, it's kind of like a window into your own life. As much as it is us helping out for a week, we can't really do a lot in a week. So what we always say is that, these churches, our church and then the other church we're partnering with, will always be ministering to each other, helping each other find out different and bigger truths about our own faith. When we go over there, I've told you, we go door to door. And in our own country, that's very taboo. You don't do that anymore because there's like cults and things that do that. So you don't go door to door. That's like selling people something. Everybody's got that no soliciting sign, or no trespassing, or that kind of thing. You don't want to invade people's space here in the United States, which is there's validity to the reason that happens here in the United States. But the other thing that's weird is that the cliquiness that exists in Christianity exists over there too. And it kind of manifests in a way that convicts you. My friend Brandon was walking next to me, and if you've ever seen my friend Brandon, he's a big white guy that is yay tall and sticks out like a sore thumb in Mexico, because where we are, most of the people are Oaxacans, which are you can't see, but about that on me. And so here's Brandon. He's taller than me, big old white guy. He's walking around and stuff, and he noticed that our guide that was taking us around to pray with people and knock on doors and things, he noticed she was going to the same exact doors every day. And the conversation, although we really couldn't understand the language, the conversation was very straightforward. It was like, one and done. You go to the door, you say howdy, hey, you maybe pray and stuff, cool, see you later. And then we started noticing that the people they were talking to actually went to the church that we were ministering at. And so Brandon asked through a translator, isn't the idea to invite these people to our outreach tonight? Well, yes, of course it is. Okay, who are you inviting? And the lady that was guiding us said, I'm inviting people from the church. So So Brandon asked, why don't we go into this area and invite people? And the grimace that took over her face went. And roughly through a translator, she went, you know, those people won't come. They don't want to come. We just don't talk to them. We don't do that. So we, in keeping with the wishes of that church, decided not to go door to door to those people. But after the worship was all done, and after the outreach was all done, which, by the way, we had enough people to fill up their small church. They're a little bit smaller than this, about half the size. We had enough people there. It was a good time of worship and everything like that. Brandon had an idea to have a barbecue outside of the church afterwards for everybody that came to the worship and everything like that. We must have had something like 50 people come to the event. It was a good event by that standard. But when we got outside, something interesting happened. As food begins to cook, and you might notice this, as food begins to cook, if you've ever cooked food in public for people, it's kind of like turning on a lantern in the middle of the woods. All of a sudden, just flies show up, right? It's kind of like that. People go, someone's cooking. And especially men, if there's barbecue involved, we all kind of like, here's the guy actually, doing this, and then we're all, what kind of briquettes are you using? That looks pretty done. Yeah, that's great. How you doing today? And it might be annoying for the person that's actually cooking. I do this when Carrie cooks too. But, the person cooking, and then I'm standing here like, yeah. That looks pretty good. Where'd you get that? Yeah. Right? But something happened. We walked out of the church, and there were probably still 50 people in the church. There were at least 150 in the streets. And we got convicted. We didn't go back and say about that church, hey, what's wrong with you? You didn't invite all those people. Brandon comes up to me and he says, Geoff, how many times have we had an event, count them down, VBS through night outreaches to whatever ministry we're doing, and we don't make food and we don't invite anybody but our own, and that's who shows up. And that's exactly what we need to learn from this. But there's another thing involved here. Going back to peace, and I'm kind of wrapping up because I'm a little bit short on time. Coming back to peace, there is a prayer that I want to pray with you today. If you take that plunge and personally start inviting this kind of person to a dinner party, kind of like Jesus is talking about, you need an incredible amount of peace because there's a big financial risk to doing this yourself. There's also a big awkwardness risk, and I believe that's why Christians don't do it. We do feel like those people across the road, or those people down there, or that person that I invite all the time to this thing, they don't want to come, they don't want to hear about it. I'm just going to strain the relationship. And I think what Jesus is trying to get through here to these Pharisees that are a lot like us, honestly, is that, look, what's more important? Do you have the peace enough to know that I am in control of everything monetarily? If you want to buy a bunch of food and invite a bunch of people and talk about God and love on people, I will support that. Have the peace to know that I am in control, but also have the peace to know that the better thing than being worried about straining relationships is losing people's souls for eternity. Would you have peace with that if that happened? So have the peace to know, Jesus is saying, that I am in control. If I ask you to do something that's out of your comfort zone, if there's a storm right now that you're in, that you need to move instead of hunker down, I have got it. That, I believe, is the powerful thing that Jesus is saying, not only through eating with people that want to kill him, but also saying, you know what? In the midst of trial, in the midst of storm, gather, love on people, make food for people, genuinely love on people, because the rest of eternity is what is at stake. So if you were following along last week, I have a dangerous prayer for you to pray. And the reason I pray dangerous prayers now is that I'm sick and tired of the thank you for my food, bless my family, may we all be happy, healthy, and may my pillow be fuzzy. tired of praying that way. Aren't you tired of praying that way? If you've gone that way and are sick of a vanilla prayer life and want to be more like each character of Jesus I'm going to go through each week, pray this prayer. Our prayer today comes from Luke 21. Luke 22, which is right near 21. Luke 22. This is another story that I maybe want to push you a little bit with because I was myself pushed in this. If you're familiar with communion, and everybody, if you're familiar with communion, you've heard this whole thing where Jesus goes and he breaks the bread, he drinks the cup, and he says, "Do this in remembrance of me," right? But what if he meant two things by that? Not only do the act, right? Not only take communion, but do this. So I'm going to read this for you. In verse 13, it says this. They left and found things just as Jesus had told them, so they prepared the Passover. When the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table, and he said to them, "I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer, for I tell you I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God." After taking the cup, he gave thanks and said, "Take this and divide it among you. For I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes." And he took the bread, gave thanks and broke it, and gave to them, saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Notice that the moment that he says, "Do this in remembrance of me," is the moment when he breaks the bread. And he refers to the bread as himself. What if Jesus is not only saying to us, partake in communion together to remember this, but what if he's also saying, remember my life, remember who I was, be broken as I am broken. So the prayer this week is one that scares the bejesus out of me currently. I have prayed it once in the past couple of days. I haven't gathered the strength to pray it again. Just a full confession for you. Have you ever asked God to break you? If you've asked God to break you before, you know there's a lot of uncomfortableness around that. And you may have fears, like I do, associated with it. What if something happens in my life that's so terrible that I become distant from my family? What if something terrible is taken from me? How will I react to that, God? The reason this comes back to peace is that in the midst of being broken, you have to have peace that God is going to put pieces back together. We look at being broken as this terrible thing, and we ask God to not let us be broken. Let us be happy, healthy, and may our pillows be fluffy. May we sleep well every night. May everything be just fine. But what kind of faith is that? What kind of life is that anyway? I don't want to live a vanilla existence that I do nothing for God, and then in the end of my life I can't say, this horrible thing happened, but you know who delivered me? And you know who I was able to reach because of this? Today, at some point, pray this prayer. God, would you break me that I may have your peace? Let's pray. Jesus, we thank you for hard teachings. We thank you because they build us up. They're like training, God. They build us up because before you give us these hard teachings and before you take us through these things in life, we really didn't have the grasp of them. We really didn't have a way to witness to others using these things, but you giving us experiences is giving us life. It's giving us fire to do what you need us to do. God, we ask for your peace today. We ask for a big sense of peace that comes over us and drowns out all fear that we have in our lives. Amen.